verse 8. Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 27 says, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me?" Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us."
Good morning. Appreciate Hal reading those verses for us. They will serve as an anchor to our topic, which is the problem of evil. Evil is a problem for us, isn't it? And when I say problem of evil, we're really going to lump suffering and hardships in there as well, and kind of tackle this from an intellectual perspective as well as an emotional one. But before we do that, we should probably define a few terms. And in those verses that Hal read, we see two things that kind of jump out at us. One, God is all-powerful. Would anybody deny that? He said it himself. Is there anything too difficult for me to do? And as a Christian, I would have to say no to that. But not only is he all-powerful, we see in Romans 5:8 that he is in the habit of demonstrating his love towards us. In fact, 1 John 4:8 says he is love. He is the very definition of love. So between these verses, we see that God is all-powerful and he is all-loving. And he's in a habit of showing that love to us. So this brings up a question in terms of evil and suffering. How can an all-powerful, all-loving God allow pain and suffering to exist in the world? We see it all around us every day, especially when we think about innocent people suffering, maybe small children who are tortured in some way. Or I know the images are still in my mind of the people jumping from the 80th floor of the World Trade Center to escape the flames. The events of 9/11, all these things, I mean, there's so many. We don't have to really look very far to see evil and suffering in the world, do we? Don't have to look very hard at all. It's there for us to observe. And what I want to provide for us is maybe an apologetic response. And as my middle school class knows, I'm not telling you I'm sorry about anything. An apologetic is a defense. We, as Christians, we should be able to defend in a rational and reasonable way why we believe the way we do. And to some Christians, this is a hard concept. I'm not saying I have all the answers. But to an atheist, this is really a matter of incompatibility. They can't see how a good God on one hand can allow evil and suffering on the other hand. They see these as logically incompatible. So I want to provide mostly an intellectual response, but I want to wrap up with an emotional one, because we don't want to leave the emotions out of it as well. But before we get to the responses, we may do well to categorize evil. There's basically two types of evil. There's moral evil and there's natural evil. Moral evil is the results of humans exercising free will. We do something that's wrong, and there's consequences. And sometimes those consequences affect many people. We may drink alcohol, get in a car to drive. We may take some illegal substance and get in a car to drive. There's so many things that we as free moral agents, and that's key to the lessons, free moral agents do that can cause evil and suffering in the world. And the other is natural evil, which we're no stranger to here in Oklahoma. There's all kinds of natural evil. There's tornadoes, wildfires, flooding. I mean, we've got a fair amount here in our state. And sometimes moral evil and natural evil become entwined. If we think about the area of the Sudan, where there's severe drought and famine taking place, that would be the natural evil. Well, the leaders of that area can sometimes withhold food, even more so, just to flesh out the rebel resistance that's among the people. So sometimes natural evil and moral evil can combine and create even more suffering than they can together. Now, the two responses I want to focus on, I said, is an intellectual response and an emotional response, and I want to give some examples of what we mean by that before we go on. If we look at Acts chapter 17, we see a good example of an intellectual response. So Paul is speaking about the resurrection of the dead in Acts chapter 17, and he's not doing it so that he can comfort the crowds. He's doing it because he's reasoning with the crowds why they should believe in Jesus. I mean, who this Jesus is and why they should put faith in him. Now, the intellectual response, I have to warn you, it can't be our only tool in the bag, right? Someone who is undergoing suffering personally and emotionally, we can't provide an intellectual answer because it may seem dry and uncaring, right? For that person, we need an emotional response. And I think a great example of an emotional response is in John chapter 11, when Lazarus had died and Jesus had made the short trip to Bethany, and he looked around and he seen the family and friends of Lazarus, and they were sad. Now, he could have done this. Jesus could have said, well, you know, Lazarus is dead because of sin. That's why he's dead. I made a very good creation. It was all very good. And when man turned his back on me and God, well, this was the consequence. But he didn't respond that way, did he? That would be more of an intellectual response, and I did it in a very sarcastic voice. But no, instead, he's seen the people weeping and how sad they were. And what did he do? He wept. He wept with them. This is an emotional response. So that's the distinction I want to make between intellectual response and an emotional response. Now, the emotional response may seem superficial or inadequate to someone who's contemplating this problem of evil on a philosophical level. So one tool doesn't fit, everything. When the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we want to look at two different tools this morning. And we want to keep these right for the right situation. So the first thing we want to look at is this logical version of an argument. Now, when I say argument, again, the atheists whom I talk to on a regular basis, they seem to say that there can't be a God who's all loving and all good and evil and suffering in the world. And what do we mean by logical argument? If I say, for example, is there such a thing as a square circle? You would have to say no. That's illogical. There's not such a thing as a square circle. Well, this is what we mean by illogical, and to them, a good and loving God and evil is not logically compatible. What we want to do today is show how those can be compatible. Now, there are a couple of hidden assumptions that the atheist may make, may not even realize he's making when he talks about this illogical incompatibility between the two. Now, in Jeremiah 32, we got this concept, and many places like it in Scripture, that God is all-powerful. And so the first thing that they may want to say is, if God is all-powerful, then he could, C-O-U-L-D, he could prevent evil, right? What does it say in Jeremiah? I am the Lord of all flesh. Is there anything too difficult for me? So if God is all-powerful, then he could prevent evil. Does that sounds correct? That's one of the hidden assumptions. What they really mean is that God could have created the world, presumably, and where free moral agents, such as humans, would always choose to do the right thing. Could God have created such a world? We'll answer that more in a moment. Then the other hidden assumption has to do with his loving nature. So in Romans 5:8 and in 1 John 4:8, we see that God is all loving, he is love, and if God is all loving, then he would, W-O-U-L-D, he would prevent evil. So you see the hidden assumptions there. If God is all powerful, he could prevent it. If he is all loving, then he would. He would demonstrate that love and prevent evils and harm and suffering from taking place. Now, on that first one, if God is all powerful, he could, I have to say, I don't see this as necessarily true. We don't typically like to think that there's things that God can't do. But there are things that are not possible for God to do. That sounds a little uncomfortable. It sounds uncomfortable saying it up here this morning, that there's some things that God can't do. Well, it's true when you think about it from a logical perspective. And I'll give you an example. Is there such a thing as a married bachelor? Can you have a married bachelor? Well, no, of course not. When the bachelor becomes married, he's no longer a bachelor. Now, he may act like he's still a bachelor, but he's still married, right? You can't have a married bachelor. That's a logical incompatibility. And when we apply this in God's terms, we can ask the question, is there anyone that God can refer to that's greater than himself? Can God refer to anybody as being more powerful than himself? No, he can't. That's not even a rational statement. In fact, Hebrews 6:13, when talking about God's promises to Abraham, says that God couldn't swear by anyone greater than himself, so he swore by himself, right? So there are things that are not logical for God to do. It just doesn't make any sense. And we've heard the arguments, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it and so forth. These are all in this same line of reasoning, that those aren't even rational thought. The things that are illogical, God can't do. He can't make a married bachelor, and he's not going to make a rock so big he can't lift it. And here's where the point I want to make on the free will. Can God make somebody freely do something? Does God grant free will? We believe he does from Scripture. We believe we have 100% free will to choose God or to reject God. Does God have the ability to grant free will on one hand and revoke it at the same time on the other? That doesn't seem to be logically compatible to me, right? When he revokes free will, it's no longer free will. You can't force somebody to do something freely. They have to choose to do something freely. And the point I want to make here is that when we freely choose and God gives us those free choices, there are consequences to those choices. God is going to let those consequences play out because of our free will. So that's response number one, if you're taking notes, to this question. If God is all-powerful, he could prevent evil. Well, the answer, not when it comes to free will. Does that make sense? He grants us free will. And it's been that way since the garden. Adam found this out pretty quickly, didn't he? God warned him, you do this, you disobey me, and you will start to die, and you'll keep dying until you're dead. Well, Adam's not here today. He died. And we have all these problems as a result. Not that we would do anything different. So as Christians, I think we're used to saying things like, there's nothing too big for my God that he can't handle, and my God can do everything. And these are definitely true, but even Jesus reminded us that a house divided can't stand. I mean, God created logic. He created reason. He wants us to use it. And he himself is not going to deny himself in that regard. So free will choices have consequences, and we can see that clearly. Now, we've probably all sat around, I know I have, and thought, well, what kind of other worlds could God have created? You ever done that exercise? It's pretty interesting. I like to imagine a world without snakes, for example. And I know at least one person that would agree with me on that. But you could also imagine worlds where there's no disease, where there were no terrible accidents. I mean, you could imagine all these things. But the thing is, when we think about any kind of possible world that God could have created, if that world has free moral agents, then in none of those worlds would there be the situation where everyone always chose the right thing. It wouldn't exist. God would have to have created robots in order for that to have happened. In fact, Paul affirms this in Romans 3:12 and says, there is none who does good, not even one. Nobody. Right? So what about the other proposition that if God is all loving, that he would prevent evil? Well, I don't see this necessarily be true as well, and I think as parents, we know this. I mean, there comes a point in every parent's parenting experience where they just can't intervene every time in their child's life in order to prevent harm or suffering, right? At some point, you let the consequences follow through so they can learn from it, right? And in fact, some of those consequences that they do will inflict pain on us themselves in order to teach us a lesson. So they have what we call morally sufficient reasons for allowing us to suffer. And I think it's the same way with God. God has morally sufficient reasons to allow pain and suffering. Just because we may not understand what those reasons are, and we may never understand them, doesn't make them any less justified as they take place. I think C.S. Lewis, I love what he said about this. He says, what do people mean when they say, I don't fear God because God is good? Have they never been to a dentist? And I think that explains the concept quite well. Even someone whose only intentions for us is good and only good will permit or even inflict pain on us in order to bring about a greater good. I've never had a root canal. I understand they're quite painful. I have had a gum transplant. Very painful. While going through it, I was not thinking good thoughts about the guy who did that to me. But But now that I have, everything's grafted and taken place and good solid structure there, it's great, right? So sometimes someone whose only intentions is good for us will allow us to go through pain and suffering in order to bring about a greater good. We are just not in a position, at least with God, to always understand what those reasons are we? There's no way that we can. And that would be response number 2, that if God is all loving, he would prevent evil. Well, not at all, because he has morally sufficient reasons for allowing or permitting evil and hardships to take place. So at this point, I've had some atheists say, well, okay, fine, I can understand that maybe he can't because of free will, and maybe he wouldn't because he's got good reasons, but what about the amounts of evil? There seems to be such large amounts of evil taking place in the world, I just can't logically accept the fact that God would allow so much of it. Well, first of all, I would have to say, if you had a set of giant scales, and you put all the good in the world on one side and all the evil on the other side, which side do you think would outweigh the other? It would have to be the good, because generally, life is worth living, isn't it? We don't have more people wanting to exit this life than we do wanting to hang on to it. It's the other way around. So I don't think that's really a fair statement to make to begin with. But one of the examples I'd like to make here has to do with the movie. I had somebody describe the movie to me. I haven't seen it myself. It's with Gwyneth Paltrow. It's called Sliding Doors. You might have seen it. But what I'm told is that, so Gwyneth Paltrow's character is trying to catch a train. She's in a subway, and she's late for the door. It's about to close, and a girl drops a doll or something in her path. Just a brief moment of time and blocks her path. Now, from that point, the movie splits into 2 parts. One part shows what would have happened to her the rest of her life if she had made the train. The other shows what would have happened to her the rest of her life if she had missed the train. And on one path, it's a happy life, successful life, but it's short. It ends in sudden death at a very young age. And then the other is a very long life, but it's full of pain and suffering and misery, in which she actually learns to be happier than she would have in any other life. What's the point? We have seemingly small, insignificant events. For example, someone dropping something in our path, causing us not to make a train, that we have no idea of the implications that has down the road. But guess who does? God does. God sees the beginning from the end and vice versa. And he knows the far-reaching consequences that something in our life that may be hard and difficult to understand could have down the road. And maybe not even for us personally, but for someone generations down the road. That's our God. That's the knowledge that our God has. So we simply just are not in position to question those things. And I'm reminded of Job chapter 38 when God says, gird up your loins like a man, and you answer me questions, right? I've got questions for you, Job. You answer me. And he begins to answer or ask a series of questions that just leaves Job dumbfounded. Like, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Or have you ever in your life commanded the dawn? Have you ever entered the spring of the deep? Tell me if you know. Of course, Job didn't have a clue. And I feel like that's the position that we're in, that we could never really fully understand the morally sufficient reasons God would have to allow hardships in our life. So that's response number 3, that we're just simply not in a position to know why God would or would not do that. But I believe he is ultimately in control of everything that happens. So in this light, it's really not appropriate, I don't think, to ask, why is God allowing me to suffer, but rather, what can I learn by going through this time of trial? And we must trust that God is in the ultimate control. And I like what Jeremiah has to say in 29:11, where the Lord says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for good and not bad, to give you a future and a hope. And I think one thing that, when we're talking to people about this idea, this problem of evil, is that we can say that God's chief purpose for us in this life is not our happiness. Wow. Can you believe that? God's chief purpose for us in this life is not our happiness, but a knowledge of him to bring us to the point where we freely choose to give our lives to him. That's the goal. Now, there is a goal of everlasting happiness, but that's not this life, is it? That's for the next. And it's interesting to me, I sometimes ask the question, can God use suffering to draw us into his kingdom? Do you think that's possible? Do you think God could use things that we would deem as bad and evil and hard to actually draw people into his kingdom? I think that's evident if we look at where are the places in the world where the gospel is growing most rapidly. Places like Ethiopia. Millions of people suffer from famine and death, and there's wars continually going on there. Yet, if we look at the stats, in 1960, the amount of Christians in Ethiopia was 0.8%, less than 1%. By the year 2000, it's 20% of the population is Christians. How can Christianity flourish in a place that has so many evils and sufferings going on? I think there's a correlation there. I think God can use those things to draw us to him. So when we're talking to people who want to make some kind of incompatibility between God and evil, we really have to ask the question, can you prove in some way that if there were no evil or hardships in this life, that just as many people would come to know God as there is in this life? And you can't prove that, obviously. There's no way to prove that. So I think as Christians, we're not surprised to see evil. In fact, we should expect it. 3 times in Romans 1, God said that he gave humans up to their own evil choices, and he allowed the consequences to follow 3 times. The last comment I want to make here on at least the intellectual side is that God's purpose is not restricted to this life alone, is it? It spills over into the next. If we look at Paul, 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, Paul presents a short but impressive list of bad things that have happened to him. We would deem these as bad things. He said not once, but 3 times he was shipwrecked. I've never been shipwrecked. Actually, that's not in 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. We'll get there in a moment. What he says in these verses is, we do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. For we look not to the things that are seen, but to things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are temporal, and the things that are unseen are eternal. See, Paul lived his life in the perspective of eternity, didn't he? In the perspective of eternity. This life is so microscopically short that if we think about eternity, think about heaven, we're with God, we're with Jesus, and day 1, day 1,000, year 10 million, year 10 billion, if we're even keeping time at all, how infinitesimally small this life will have seemed no matter what we had to go through while we're here. And I think that gives us hope. So that would be response number 4, is that God's purpose for us in this life is not our own happiness, right? But a knowledge of him, and his purpose is not restricted to this life alone. So I think it turns out this problem of evil is really less of a problem for a Christian than it is for someone who's a deist or specifically an atheist. But what about the emotional response? And I mentioned there's a couple ways to answer this problem, the intellectual way and the emotional way. I think sometimes, perhaps, one of the most important things is not to say anything at all, but just rather to be there for someone who's going through hardships, to sympathize, to empathize, and to be a friend to them. But on the other hand, sometimes people are going to want counsel. Well, what do you say? When something really terrible and seemingly evil suffering comes someone's way, what can you say about that? Well, I think the atheist would want you to believe that God has abandoned you. He may say, where is your God amidst all your pain? Has he stepped away from his precious created humans and left you on your own? Because that's really the concept I even think a lot of Christians have sometimes, is that God created everything, put things in motion, and then took his hands off the wheel and just let things run their course. Well, I don't see that at all being the case. In fact, God does not vanish from us, but he became one of us, didn't he? He walked the earth. He wept, as we've seen in John chapter 11. He was tempted like we are. Before he died on the cross, he prayed earnestly for that cup to pass from him. He was pierced by a sword, along with his hands and feet with the nails. I mean, these are physical things. He died while he was here in human form. But not only did he endure these physical hardships, but he endured something that I don't think we could ever understand, and that's being separated from his Father. Someone who knew no separation from God allowed himself to be separated for a short time as he took upon the whole punishment for the entire human race. We could never understand what kind of suffering that he went through during that time, much less the physical side of it. So I think when we look at the problem of evil in the light of the cross, it puts it in an entirely different perspective. See, in the light of a cross, what we see is that the true problem of evil is our problem of evil. The true problem of evil is our problem of evil. We're filled with sin and we're morally guilty before God. And the question shouldn't be, how can God justify himself to us? How can God allow me to go through these things? But rather, how can I be justified in him? That's the question, isn't it? So often we see it the other way because we're selfish. I know I am. But the real question should be, how can I be justified before him? So I think God is the final answer to the problem of evil. But if there is no God, if God doesn't exist, then we are locked in a world filled with gratuitous and unredeemable suffering. And I agree with Paul. What a pitiful state that would be if that were true. But God does exist, and he does redeem us from evil through the cross, and he takes us into an unimaginable good after the life that we lived here. But that's only true if we have freely chosen to give ourselves to him. And as we stand and sing the invitation song, those are the concepts I'd like to leave you with this morning. That God has not abandoned us, as some say, but he actually has stepped in and became one of us, suffered right along with us, and gave all for us.